All right, this is our very last speaker of the day. And what's ironic about this is it's my favorite topic. My mother insisted we have family dinners. And in fact, we ate very, very late, which I used to think was European time, just so we could wait for my dad to come home from work. And at dinner time, my mother would always say, "Tell me something interesting about your day." So I'm very excited to hear what you have to say. Dr. Ann Fischel is the author of Home for Dinner, Mixing Food, Fun, and Conversation for a Happier Family and Healthier Kids. Is your book available here?
It's
Great, right outside. And I'm sure she can sign it for you after. Dr. Fischel is also the co-founder of the Family Dinner Project. She works as an associate clinical professor of psychology at Harvard Medical Center and is the director of the Family and Couples Therapy Program at Massachusetts General Hospital. She'll be talking today about how to get the most out of your family dinners. Please help me welcome Dr. Ann Fischel.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. Well, welcome, and please feel free to come forward if you'd like. I'm going to start with two stories to tell you why, as a family therapist and a community activist and a working mother of two sons, I am making such a big deal out of family dinner. So the first story starts when my second son was born and my husband gave up smoking. And I thought, what can I do to give him an oral pleasure every night that he could look forward to? And I thought, family dinner. And so I threw myself into the making of delicious dinners. And what I didn't realize would be all the positive and unintended consequences of that. I had two little boys, and it turned out they loved to keep me company, making potions in the kitchen and banging around with pots and pans and stirring the soup. And whatever they had a hand in, whatever they felt they were a stakeholder in, they were willing to eat. And so they grew up really being quite adventurous about food. And this was fine until they became teenagers. And then they started to be very demanding. They wanted to have new recipes from countries we'd never been to, food I'd never cooked. And they would be quite discerning as restaurant critics. They would say, "I think you cut a corner here," or "this needed more salt." And one night, I just got fed up with it, and I went on strike, which, as a family therapist, I'm not so proud of, but I went on strike and I said, I'm not going to cook anymore until we change the rules around here. And after 2 nights of my husband's cooking, they said, well, we'd like to come back. We'd like you to come back. And they agreed that they would be more appreciative, but more importantly, my younger son said, I would like to start cooking red meat. Our house had been vegetarian and fish and chicken, but no red meat. And I realized this was kind of food karma because I had done the same thing to my mother, but in the other direction. When I was about my son's age, I had stopped eating meat, and she had to make room for me in the kitchen to make vegetarian dishes. And I realized that here in the kitchen, my son and I would be starting to experiment with a new role as an adolescent and a mother. And I would have to loosen my control and be more open about all kinds of things, starting with food. So that was the first story I wanted to tell. The second is a professional story. I see patients in my house in the basement, and my office lies below the kitchen. And often I will see a last patient at the end of the day around 6 o'clock, and I'll pop a chicken in the oven. Well, one night I had done that, I'd gone downstairs, and after about half an hour, I was sitting with a father and son who really hadn't spoken to each other in weeks. And we all started to smell the lemon and the garlic of the roasting chicken coming through the heating vents. And I guiltily thought, how many more minutes till I can go have dinner? And the son turned to me and he said, could we stay for dinner? And I sort of laughed nervously and tried to change the subject. but I had a kind of an epiphany in that moment, because what I realized is that this father and son, and actually every family I see in therapy, would be so much better off if they just left my office, if I just shoved a cookbook at them and I said to them, go make dinner and don't bother coming back to family therapy. Because if you could have family dinner every night, that would be so much better for you. Well, it turns out that there is research to back up, there are actually 100 studies that back up this intuitive sense I had. And I just want to briefly share some of the research with you. It turns out that regular family dinners are great for the body and the brain and the soul, the mental health of family members. And starting with the brain, the conversation that you have at the dinner table is a better vocabulary booster than reading aloud for young kids. And kids who have regular family dinners do better in school, and it's a better predictor of high achievement than doing homework, than doing sports, than doing art. And learning to tell stories, kids who know how to tell stories also are better readers and earlier readers. And I just read a study actually that when young kids talk about math at the table, like eat half your broccoli, that a year later their math skills are better. So that was just a study just in the last week. It's also good nutritionally. So the family dinners tend to be much more packed with fruits and vegetables and lower in fat and sugar and salt. And even if you don't try, they tend to be lower in calories, which I think is why obesity rates are lower for families who have regular family dinners. And they continue to pay dividends. So kids who grew up having family dinners become young adults who eat more healthily and have lower obesity rates. And that's not all. It's also really good for mental health. It's associated with all kinds of preventative behaviors that parents pray for, particularly for their teenagers. So it's associated with lower rates of substance abuse, tobacco use, early sexual activity, fewer eating disorders, less depression, less anxiety, more fun, less stress, greater resilience, all of these things. And wasn't this exactly what I was trying to do as a family therapist? So it's no wonder that I wanted to send that family home, or at least say out loud, you really should be having family dinner. And I probably would have saved myself a lot of time and trouble if I had done that. But instead, I wrote this book, Home for Dinner, and started a nonprofit called the Family Dinner Project. But before I go any further, I just want to share a short movie clip, 90 seconds, that tells you what I'm not talking about, because I don't want anybody to have the idea that I'm talking about family dinner in a nostalgic, Leave It to Beaver, 1950s kinds of way. So here is a brief clip that's mainly for fun, but I think will make a point.
Dinner time.
Supper's ready. Come on, y'all. Been slaving over this for hours.
Brother helps mother to her chair as he would his best girl.
Dear Lord, baby Jesus, we thank you so much for this bountiful harvest of Domino's, KFC, and always delicious Taco Bell.
Woo! Woo! Woo!
The dinner date has begun.
Whoa!
How are you?
And they're all happy about it.
Your father and I were just discussing his day at work.
They converse pleasantly. It is not only good manners, but good sense.
May I have the salt?
What do we say?
Now.
Pleasant, unemotional conversation is the keynote at dinner time.
Janie, today I quit my job. Pass the asparagus.
And I marvel that you can be so contemptuous of me on the same day that you lose your job.
I didn't lose it. It's not like, whoops, where'd my job go? I quit. Someone pass the asparagus.
Oh, your husband feels he can just quit his job and you don't
Will
realize
someone
who's
please
gonna make a
pass me the
I'm not going to be a part of this.
And another thing. From now on, we're going to alternate our dinner music because, frankly, I'm really tired of this Lawrence Welk.
Well, do you begin to see now how a date with your family can be a truly special occasion?
So the visuals and the auditory were a little out of sync, but I think you probably got the idea that these were not ideal family dinners. And the point I want to stress is that families are not going to get all the terrific benefits that the scientific literature tells us about if they're like the dinners that are depicted in American Beauty or some of the others. That it's important that the atmosphere be warm and welcoming and that it be a fun and enjoyable time. If people are yelling at each other or sitting in stony silence, all bets are off about whether family dinner is really going to do much for the members. So I want to talk a little bit about the Family Dinner Project, which is a nonprofit that I co-founded in 2010 with several other people who all shared the common belief in the power of family dinners. And it's an organization that champions family dinners as a time for families to come together for healthy eating, to have fun at the table, and to have conversation about things that matter. We work online, and there are many, many resources that you can get for free about how to have to make recipes that take 30 minutes or less, games that you can play at the table, and interesting conversations. And then we also work in real time with communities. I've been out to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, where they were having a campaign to make home the hub of health. We've worked with YMCAs. I just did a community dinner at a homeless shelter in New York. And so we've been going all over the country doing these in-person community dinners. And I just want to tell you about one of them, which was at the Lynn School in Massachusetts, which is probably the poorest city in Massachusetts. 90% of the kids there qualify for free breakfasts. And we brought together about 10 or 15 families, and we do what we always do. This is a community dinner we had in Rochester, Minnesota. We cook together. We make a lasagna or tacos, guacamole. We eat together. Then we'll play games, like we might say, everybody go around the table and say a rose, a thorn, and a bud from your day. This, I understand, is a game that the Obamas play at their table. So a rose is something positive that happened, a thorn is something difficult, and a bud is something that you would like to have happen tomorrow. And it's another way of getting conversation going without asking the same tedious question of how was your day, which some kids and some families do fine with, but some people get a little bored of it. I know my kids did. Then we might play some other games. We might go around and say 2 truths and a lie, or 2 truths and a wish that happened during the day. And then we eat, the kids then go off and they make dessert. They might put heavy cream into containers and whip it up and make whipped cream and then put it on fruit and bring it out to the parents. And meanwhile, I meet with the parents alone and I ask them, what are your biggest challenges to family dinner? And really, wherever I go, no matter what the background is of the families or the community, the obstacles seem to be the same. And you probably could make this list yourselves. It's scheduling. We're just so busy as parents and as kids. Sometimes parents say, I get my kids to the table, but then there's so much conflict and tension, it's just not worth it. Another problem is picky eaters or not enough money to buy nutritious food. So whatever the problem is for the community that I'm working with, I turn to the parents and I say, I bet in this group you all have solutions to this common problem. So let's brainstorm together what you do to combat these problems. And here's an example of, say, picky eaters. I've heard so many innovative ideas about how to combat picky eaters. For example, one is I have my child taste something and ask them to give me 5 words to describe the taste. And when they do that, they can't just automatically reject the food. Or I always, if I'm introducing a new food, I always put it next to something that's really familiar, because we tend to like familiar foods. And in fact, nutritionists will say, you need to keep showing the same food at least 15 times before you entirely give up on it. It turns out, this is a little bit of an aside, but I just found this fascinating when I came across it, that when babies taste a carrot juice when they're in utero, when their mothers have carrot juice, then when months later, when they come out in the world and they actually taste carrot juice, they're much more likely to like it and to smile because it's familiar. So that's kind of a general rule, that familiarity makes us more accepting of foods. So for each of these obstacles, another idea is that you should never say to your kids, once you have your broccoli, you can have your dessert. That tends to backfire and make the broccoli really unappealing. So other common obstacles are reducing tension, and some ideas are to keep hot button topics off the table. You don't need to discuss that D that your child got in math at the dinner table. Better to do it later on a full stomach. Maybe go easy on manners, table manners, and just emphasize the ones that help with conversation, like don't talk with your mouth full, but maybe elbows on the table. You could let that go so that you're not constantly having to be vigilant about telling your kids what to do and what not to do. And limit technology at the table, which it turns out is harder for parents to do than kids. I conducted a study recently and found that twice as many parents as kids are using their gadgets, their screens at the table. So I think best to just make it a rule for both parents and kids to check their phones at the door, and it's one fewer thing to have to fight about. And then if you don't like to cook, I hate to say, if you don't like to cook, forget about family dinners. I don't believe that at all. I think there's really too much emphasis on food when it comes to family dinners. And really it's food that brings us to the table, but it's everything else. Laughter, playing games, having interesting conversations, that's what keeps us there. And so to families who don't like to cook, or parents don't like to cook, I would say teach your kids so they can help out. Maybe have breakfast for dinner, because that's an easier lift. Have lunch for dinner. Make big batches of food so that next week it's like you had a sous chef. You can open your freezer and you've got something that you made last week and you've got dinner half done. So these are some other kinds of solutions. Now, as I've been talking to families, both in my practice and going across the country, working with families in communities, and writing my book, I've discovered 4 additional benefits that really don't show up in the scientific literature. And that's what I want to share with you now. So the first benefit is the way that we can play with food. And I know this might sound a little subversive, certainly a little messy, and I know I was not allowed to play with my food when I was a child, and I was not that happy when my son got detention for a middle school food fight. So I'm not talking just go crazy, but I will say this, that as our worlds have become so much more virtual, where we're playing so much, video games and on the internet, food is one of the few places where we use all our senses. We can taste, we can smell, we can touch, and it's something that we can do together as a family. And that seems reason enough to get a little messy. And so I encourage families to play with all the different elements of food. The shape, by making numbers and creatures out of dough. With smell, by closing your eyes and seeing if you can guess, is it a banana I'm smelling? Is it cinnamon? What is it? By playing with color and collage, by putting out all the ingredients that you're going to have for a salad and saying to your family, take what you want and on your plate, make a face, make a nest. A family at the homeless shelter, the little girl, I'd never seen someone do this, made a bird's nest with eggs and little birds out of her salad ingredients. So make something. And the only rule is you have to eat your own creation. So that would be another way of playing with food. And then, of course, playing with games. Playing games at the table is a way to extend the time, to make it a little bit more fun. One game that I love is a game called Would You Rather. This is particularly fun with young kids. Would you rather eat a bowl of crickets or a bowl of worms? Would you rather live in the past or live in the future? Would you rather be able to fly or be able to swim? And trust me, if you start going down this line of ridiculousness, your kids will come up with some of their own categories. In my book, I've got probably 20 different games for kids of all ages that are word games that are, easy to play at the dinner, that don't require dice or boards or anything like that. So these are all ideas to play with your food. You can also help create a little scientist, because you can change, by changing one element of a recipe, you can see how it turns out, or you can do pickling. Kids can pickle ice cream and avocados and all kinds of things and see the scientific process of fermentation going on before their eyes. Okay, so I think another fun game is to cut up little strips of paper with conversation starters. Who's your best friend? If you could have a friend who's a character in a book, who would that be? If you were a season, what season would you be? Anyway, there are many conversation starters on the Family Dinner Project website and in my book. And what we do is cut those little conversation starters into a jar, and each family member takes one out, answers it if they like it. If they don't, they put it back in, or somebody else might want to answer the same question. And it's just a very playful way for getting different kinds of conversations going. So that's one new benefit of family dinner. Another is the power of storytelling, which has become kind of a lost art. We don't tell stories around campfires anymore. We don't write stories in long letters anymore. But the family dinner table is really a place to tell stories. Tell stories about family members, about how somebody moved from this country, from another country to our country. And it turns out that kids who know stories about their families grow up to be more resilient, to recover more easily from slings and arrows of everyday life, to have greater self-esteem and more of a sense of the future. And I think that's because when you hear stories about your family, you feel like you're connected to something bigger than yourselves. This research comes from Emory, from a bunch of researchers. Duke is the lead researcher. And he came up with 20 questions that he asked kids. And the kids who knew more of those questions were more resilient and had higher self-esteem. And some of the questions were things like, do you know where your name came from? Do you know the things that some of the lessons that your parents have learned? Do you know how your parents came when they first came to this country? And the important thing here is not to know the answer to these 20 questions. the important thing is to tell whatever stories are interesting in your family. And here are some examples of types of stories that you might want to tell or probably already do tell. And I've mentioned some of them, but others are love stories, stories about overcoming adversity. I call them lemonade from lemon stories, which tend to be the most potent of any kind of stories that we can tell. Or a story about a recipe. This is a photograph I took of my mother's ice cream cake that she used to make at dinner parties. My mother was an artist, and she did not like to stay very long in the kitchen. She liked to be where the action was and talking, and so this cake she could make in about 8 minutes, and it's beautiful and elegant, and when I make it, I think about her. Anyway, when I make this recipe and I tell the story, I think about when I was a little girl and I would try to stay up late in order to get a piece of this marvelous cake. So the third kind of bonus to family dinner is the way it can be a place to experiment with new behavior. And I think the story I told at the beginning was an example of that cooking with my son was a way of experimenting with adolescent roles, of trying to make more room for him as a young adult in the kitchen, and for me to back off. But I do it sometimes with families in my practice where I might say to them, gosh, you're so hard on each other. You're so critical of one another. Could we maybe try having you say some kind things or to admire some things about each other? And if that goes okay, then I might say, maybe you'd like to experiment with that at the dinner table. And maybe the first person who slips up and says something kind of snarky or negative has to do the dishes. But what I'm trying to do here is make dinner almost an annex to my office, a place where a family could practice some new behavior many more times during the week than they can try it in my office. And then the last thing that I want to emphasize is the way that dinner can be a launching pad for getting your kids interested in the wider world. So just to start with, cooking food from another culture is a way of bringing other worlds to your table. And sometimes in my house, my husband is a professor and is in charge of international students who come from all over the world. And they come to our house for a family dinner. And we used to say, bring food from your cultures. And they would come with little styrofoam tubs from takeout restaurants. And it was not a very delicious dinner. They didn't have time, they didn't have kitchens to cook really home-cooked food. So after a few years of these disappointing dinners, we said to them, come, we'll make a Thanksgiving, we'll make an American dinner for you in September. It was a little tough to find turkeys in September, but we figured out a way. And we would have these students from Saudi Arabia, from India, from China come, and we could teach them a little bit about our culture, but more importantly, we learned so much using food as a vehicle to their worlds. So I would say to them, tell me about the celebrations in your countries. What do you eat? What do you celebrate? Who's considered family? Who gets invited to these big occasions? What's considered comfort food where you come from? What does your mother make for you when you're sick? And often sick foods were pretty similar. Salty, chickeny, sometimes very spicy foods seem to cross a lot of yellow foods were sick foods. So this would be another way of bringing the world, the bigger world, to the dinner table. And then I've been very interested in the way that you can talk about garbage and waste at the table as a way to start getting children interested in the environment and sustainability. So I might say to my kids, do you know that as Americans, we throw away 40% of the food we produce. Do you know that American families throw away $2,000 a year of perfectly good food, or $165 billion a year? I wonder what we could do to help with this, because it's not only that we're wasting money, but all that food that we throw out and that supermarkets throw out goes into landfills and gives off methane emissions that pollute our planet. And actually, if we ate a quarter less of red meat, it would be the equivalent of taking 6 to 8 million cars off the road. But what else could we do? Well, we could compost, we could eat lower on the food chain, we could go talk to supermarkets and say, why do you throw out perfectly good food, even if it is a little bit cosmetically imperfect? And there's some other ideas here. Eating local, saying to your kids, let's draw a map around where we live that's 100 miles from here, and let's see what we could figure out that we could eat that grows or can be found within 100 miles. Maybe we could have one meal a week like that. So you may have been pondering, why would family dinners be so effective? Why would it confer all these benefits? And I think there are two main reasons, maybe three. The first is that in our busy 21st century lives, family dinner is really the most reliable time that we have to get together. It's the time that we're most likely to find out about each other's days, to have a good laugh with one another, to connect. And kids who feel connected to their parents have kind of a seatbelt on that potholed road of childhood and adolescence. It's not like we still farm together or stitch quilts on the front porch. No, dinner is really the time that most of us do have to spend with one another. For some families, it's breakfast, which is just as good as dinner, or it might be even an evening snack that you set aside and have fruit and cheese and a cup of hot chocolate. But dinner is, for most of us, is the easiest time. So, and actually when teenagers are asked, when is the time you're most likely to talk to your parents, they say family dinner, with being in the car as the second. And speaking of teens, when they're asked, what are your favorite activities, dinner scores pretty high on that list. So even though we might think teens are too busy for us or have lost their interest in family conversation, it's really not true, and probably teens need family dinner the most of any age group. So family dinner as an opportunity for connection would be the first reason why it's so powerful. And the second is that family dinner is a ritual. It has a beginning, middle, and end. It occurs in a particular time and space. It has parts of it that unfold the same way every night. Most families sit in the same seats night after night, but we don't know what we're going to talk about. Often the food is different from night to night, so that's the sort of surprise element. And family dinner has a metaphor right at the heart of it, which is the food. And it's often a metaphor for love, for nurture. It can be also, sadly, a metaphor for control and other not so great things. So as a ritual, it's protective. It's adults and kids really need rituals to feel that the world is a stable and predictable place. It helps us step away from the hubbub of everyday life and know that there's going to be one time during the day that we can sort of relax and let our hair down. And I think it's the ritual part of dinner that explains the other part that makes it so powerful. And I would say, thirdly, when we turn off the TV and we speak while we're eating, we'll tend to eat less than we would if we just ate mindlessly. And I think that explains, in part, the lower rates of obesity that are connected with family dinner. So just in conclusion, I want to offer one confession, which is that when my boys were young and I was a busy and tired and frazzled working mother who often didn't know what I was going to make for dinner, and there was no food in the house, and my kids had already spoiled their appetites with snacking, and it was not always an easy or a happy situation, the dinner time. The best dinner for me, this is my confession, would be Friday night when I would take a nap from 6 to 7. And when I woke up, my sons and my husband would have gone to the local takeout restaurant and gotten some big vat of greasy food, and I really didn't care what it was. I was so grateful for that delicious nap one night a week. So I'm going to stop there, and if there are any questions, or any associations to your own family dinners, I'd love to hear them. I'm going to be outside if anybody would like me to sign my recent book. Nothing would make me happier. So,
Dr. Fischel, thank you so much.
Welcome.
Are there any questions? I'm sure you might like to speak to her outside too, but are there any questions that we could share with everyone? I wonder about these busy families today. I know very few families that eat a meal together. How can you make the best use of time when maybe there's just a child sitting at the bar in the kitchen on a stool?
Yeah, that the bar at the stool, I think, is not so great for family dinners, because usually it makes the parent be up and down and like fetching things. It's much, I think, more conducive to sitting and talking if you're at a table. But the average American meal is only 22 minutes. So we're not talking heavy lift here. It's really, making a commitment, and it doesn't have to be every night of the week, and it could be some breakfast, it could be dinner, it could be that evening snack where you take a break from homework. The research says 5 nights a week, but I think it's important for families to make a commitment to whatever they can do. And sometimes it might mean having dinner late, as you were saying, and maybe giving the kids an appetizer course to tide them over so that they can make it to 8 o'clock when everybody's home.
Are there any other questions? All right. Oh, we do have a question over here. Yeah.
One thing I try to do a couple times a week is have an early dinner.
Early dinner.
Because it just seems like people are in a better mood and people aren't as tired, including myself. So if there's a weekend day, usually like a Saturday or Sunday, if there's not 8 million things going on, and I know I'm going to be home, it's like we're eating at 4, boom, and everybody just seems like it just works so much better than the usual 6:37 weeknight where everybody's tired and cranky. So that's just a little.
That's a great idea. And I think having one night or 2 nights where you do something different, which might be playing music during dinner, or having dinner in a different room of the house or at a different time, I think that also can kind of enliven the ritual a little bit. That's a great idea.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ann Fischel. Let's give her a hand. Thank you.
Thank you.